Hi students, welcome to HSC Biology and Module 8, Non-infectious disease and disorders. This is video number 5, and we're going to be talking very briefly about water balance in plants. This is another one of these areas where there's quite a lot that's encompassed in the learning intention, that you can investigate various mechanisms used by organisms to maintain their internal environment within tolerance limits, including mechanisms in plants that allow water balance to be maintained. So we focused up to this point in our discussions around homeostasis on particularly human and animal adaptations. So now we want to have a look at some of the plant adaptations that specifically relate to maintaining water balance. You'll know that you've been successful because you'll be able to identify at least one mechanism used by plants to maintain water balance, to describe several different strategies, or perhaps even to evaluate a range of mechanisms that are used by plants to maintain water balance. So what we need to just remember, I guess, before we talk about some of what's going on here, is some of what we already know about plants and also what we know about water. Water is an amazing solvent. It has a lot of properties that allow it to dissolve a large range of different types of substances, and it's a primary transport mechanism. And it is a primary transport mechanism in animals, just like it is in plants. But it's more than that too. It's a reactant in chemical reactions, and it's also a product of different chemical reactions. So for example, water is a reactant in probably one of the most important chemical processes that occurs in plants, which is photosynthesis, but it's also a product of respiration. And plants use photosynthesis, being autotrophs, to produce their own food, their own energy source. But like animals, they need to use that energy source to release energy in a form that's available for them to use in their cells. And that happens again through respiration. So photosynthesis allows the conversion of light energy into high energy chemicals, glucose molecules, and that requires carbon dioxide and water. And then in the process, the reverse process, I guess, is one of the ways we talk about these two processes, is as being complementary processes, even though it's not quite that simple. But we do end up with water as a product. As I mentioned, it's an important transport medium, and it's important not just through the xylem, which is the primary transport for water and salts, but we also have water moving through the phloem, where we have sugars. And that's because water can exert, through osmotic pressure, a change in the concentrations of solutes as they move through the plant. Water also plays a very important role in turgidity, and I guess here we're talking very specifically, and it's something we will talk about in this video, about the guard cells as part of the stomata. And that's a way of regulating how much water is lost by the plant. So be very careful when you're discussing water balance in plants. What we can't do is eliminate water losses. What we're trying to do is reduce or regulate water loss, so that as the water is moving through the plant, we're not losing too much and allowing the plant to dry out, dehydrate. And as we've looked at previously with animals, water can also be used for temperature regulation, for things like evaporative cooling. So there are a whole range of different ways in which water is used in plants, and each of these ways, I guess, helps to reinforce just how important water is as a chemical substance in plants. So therefore, it becomes very critical for us to understand some of the ways that plants have in order to conserve and to move water around within the plant. Just as we looked at previously, there are structural, physiological and behavioral adaptations. Behavioral adaptations may be a little trickier, and I'll give you something to think about before the end of this video. But there are a range of different adaptations that we notice in plants that help or relate in some way to maintaining water balance within the individual plants. Probably the most obvious of those is the distribution and abundance of stomata. That's the guard cells that are guarding the stoma, that little space which allows for gas exchange. And of course, one of the things that's very important when we start looking at some of these is that there's going to be perhaps a number of different factors that are competing with each other when we look through this, in order for us to get this little sense of exactly what's the primary driver of some of these processes. So for example, gas exchange, release of carbon dioxide from the plant, intake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the plant, and at the same time water is transpiring out through the stoma as well. So there's obviously carbon dioxide is critically important for the plants for photosynthesis, and the leaves, which are usually the structure within the plant that has the greatest number of stomata, also have the greatest number of chloroplasts. And you have these specialized cells, these mesophyll cells, that carry out a large amount of photosynthesis and therefore are going to require both carbon dioxide and water. So we can thicken the cuticles. So the cuticles themselves usually we find on the upper surface of the leaf, and that helps to create an impervious layer so that we don't lose water from the upper surface. Usually water is going to be lost from the lower surface. But that cuticle can be thickened, very waxy, which again helps increase the protection and decrease the water loss. Sometimes we find the flowers or the leaves themselves can be modified. We have a lot of sclerophyll leaves in Australia. A large number of plants have these really crisp, hard leaves, rather than, say, in contrast to something like a lettuce, which has very soft leaves. And that harder leaf is, again, something that is helping to reduce the amount of water that's being lost through the surface of the leaf. Cladodes are modified structures in the stem usually. So we often associate cladodes with succulents like cacti, succulents. Desert plants where rainfall is very, very low, where the expectation is there's going to be very low water, so it's really important that the plant's able to store water in some structure somewhere, and these sort of swollen stems, often one of the ways in which plants can store water. Fine hairs can be another one because it helps to reduce water loss. And just as we said with the modified flowers and the leaves, woody fruits as well, again, and again, you're comparing this to something like a watermelon, which is extremely watery. You don't want to be losing too much water when you're putting it into these structures, which will be then lost from the plant if water is scarce or if the plant's in danger of dehydration. So these are structures. These are all different things we could dissect, remove from the plant, have a look at them to sort of see exactly what's going on in these areas and how they are adaptations to water loss, or at least water regulation. That said, we do find a few physiological adaptations as well. We know that guard cells are a particular structure, but they can become turgid or flaccid based on the amount of water that they have in them, which is going to affect the stomatal opening. And so whether or not, and that's going to regulate water movement. I've talked about water storage in the stem. There's actual structures, but then the water has to actually be stored in those structures. Deciduous plants is an interesting one. This is the one that I mentioned at the beginning of the video in terms of do the fact that some plants lose their leaves in the autumn leading into the winter, is that a behavioral adaptation? Is it a physiological adaptation? I've put it here in physiological because there's a lot of things that the plant is actually doing, withdrawing some of the very important materials that it may need, especially chlorophyll. You'd know from deciduous plants that they lose the green color. They turn sort of the yellowy, reddish, brown sort of color before they fall. and that's a way of the plant trying to recoup some of those important chemicals and not just let them be lost from the plant. But obviously that's really reducing the surface area that's available for water exchange by losing all of your leaves during those colder months of the year. Secretion of saponins, which is a particular type of chemical that we find in river red gums, or the way in which the plant grows, the growth spurts that we see from the sago palms. These are all different types of mechanisms that plants have in order to help regulate or change the way that water may be moving through the plant, and to hopefully reduce or at least regulate the way in which water is being lost from different surfaces. As I said, the big thing with plants is that we're looking at a balance. We're looking at a very delicate balance between the fact that a very large amount of water that moves through the plant actually is just lost through transpiration. It's a continuous stream where water is moving from the roots through the xylem and out through the stoma in the leaves. Of course, too much of that that's not being replaced can lead to dehydration. So while we do want to have all of those materials moving through the plant, we don't want to be losing too much water through dehydration. In very hot environments, water can be used for evaporative cooling. Sometimes we even see things like sunken stomates, where they sit below that level of the epidermal cells and create like little mini caves, if you like, where that water can cool. Condense and evaporate, and that can help with temperature regulation, which is a kind of the way that an alternate way in which the plants perspire, if you like. Reduction in the surface area of the leaves is also a really good strategy for minimizing or reducing the amount of water that's being lost. But of course, reducing the surface area of the leaves also reduces the amount of sunlight that can be captured by those photosynthetic cells. And so therefore, too much reduction in leaf surface area could reduce the amount of light that reaches the plant and therefore affect the rate of photosynthesis. So again, something that may be helping to reduce water loss may also be reducing photosynthetic rate. And the third thing which I did talk about is that stomatal opening also affects gas exchange. So we know that there were some important gases that we looked at, carbon dioxide, oxygen, as well as water. All of these are gases that will be exchanged through the stomatal openings, and all of which will be affected by whether they are turgid or flaccid, whether they are opening, allowing good exchange of gases, or whether they're closing down and reducing that exchange. So the thing with plants is that there's a huge range of different types of strategies that plants have for looking at maintaining water balance and regulating transport of materials around, all of which are based on water. And we'll look at a few more of these in a little bit more detail in class. Thanks for watching.